The two short stories, The Secret and Keel and Cool by Janet Frame, both depict a child protagonist suffering in reaction to the death of a sister. Frame herself experienced this pain as both her sisters, Myrtle and Isabel, both drowned young, though in separate accidents. Through these stories, she explored the theme of death and how a child coped with this unfamiliar concept. In doing so, she captured the absolute torment of losing a sister. This was achieved through a variety of literary techniques that, although were spoken through the voice of a child, were deeply effective in expressing her pain. The Secret opens by directly plunging us into a description of Myrtle, the protagonist's elder sister. The protagonist is a young girl called Nini who looks up to her sister with complete adoration. The majority of the story consists of a detailed overview of Myrtle, as seen through Nini's eyes. The character of Myrtle is described as full of life. The last section of the story distorts this image, as it is revealed that she is suffering from heart failure and will not be living for long. Frame uses The Secret to explore how the young child, Nini, reacts to this realization. Keel and Cool also presents the theme of death, but unlike The Secret, the story occurs after the sister has already passed away. Winnie, the young protagonist, is devastated by the loss of her sister Eva. There is a very strong degree of sadness in the story because the family is trying desperately to move past Eva's death. They have even taken in their neighbour Joan as a replacement for Eva. The day starts seemingly well, but ends on a note of tragedy, with Winnie lamenting Eva's death and hating Joan for not understanding her loss. In both of the short stories, there is a dominant tone of admiration from the young protagonists for their sister. This is most prominent in The Secret, as Nini's descriptions of Myrtle show her devotion. She was all filled with a longing to be grown up. This hyperbolic language presents an aspect of Myrtle's character that Nini admired. Myrtle was a dreamer. Nini spoke of her as having the hair, the figure, the looks, the making of a great actress. The tone of voice suggests her childlike perception of her sister and the certainty she had in her sister's future. The repetition of "We talked and talked about Ginger Rogers and Janet Gaynor mostly, and what we would do when we were 21, adds to this innocence that Nini had, caught up in the dreams of her idealist sister. Frame uses these techniques to sharpen the grief of losing Myrtle. All the talks of their futures had now become futile, because there was no future for them, not together and not for Myrtle. "I like the smell of Myrtle, she smelt alive." These minor sentences and the metaphor of "smelt alive" add to the sense of vitality that Myrtle had and magnifies the impact of her death. In Keel and Cool, Winnie is also very much in awe of her elder sister. This is apparent in her obvious envy of Joan, her sister's best friend. When watching Joan, Winnie remarks wistfully how nice to say bother and brush your hair out of your eyes. Eva's hair had been long. She was jealous of Joan and her similarities with her sister, things that she did not have. Joan had secrets with Eva. They used to whisper together and giggle and talk in code. The tone of voice suggests Winnie's envy. Even though Eva has passed away, Winnie's childlike tone of jealousy is evident. This is continued later in the story when Joan is showing Winnie a trick that Eva taught her. When Joan asks whether Eva showed Winnie, she replies, "Yes," lied Winnie, "Eva showed me Christmas trees." This is repeated again with, "She showed me too," lied Winnie, "Eva showed me a lot of things." There is an obvious tone of jealousy in the way that she reacts. This presents Winnie as a very sad child, trying desperately to act as stoic as a young child can. In The Secret, the protagonist Nini's immediate reaction to her discovery of Myrtle's condition was denial. Frame beautifully illustrates the emotional turmoil of a young child when finding out that their sister is dying. Nini is unable to deal with this concept. In her mind, Myrtle has an entire future ahead of her. Frame repeats the line, "Myrtle couldn't die," to show how Nini is trying to convince both her mother and herself. Nini explains why her sister cannot die, with the simile of Grandma had died, but then Grandma was old with no legs and a shriveled up face like an old brown walnut. To her, death happens when someone is old, not when they are, like Myrtle, full of youth. She continues with the hyperbole of Granddad had died, but Granddad was old too. He must have been living for years and years before the beginning of the world. And similar to the simile in describing Grandma, Nini states that he was like one of the old men in the poem, whose hands are like claws and whose knees are twisted like the old thorn trees. This reveals Nini's naivety, as her childlike innocence has limited her view of death. She sees it as something out of a story, like old thorn trees or an old brown walnut. This is why Nini cannot understand why Myrtle is to die when Myrtle is none of those things. In Keel and Cool, there is no denial, as Winnie's sister had already died. Instead, Frame illustrates the emotional pain of the child by repetition. Winnie wished her mother would call out to them. She wished her father were back from the river. She wished Joan were away and there were just father and mother and Winnie and no Joan. Her repetition of wished conveys to the reader the suffering of the little child. Frame shows that Winnie knows deep down that her sister is never coming back, but being the child that she is, there is still the element of hope. The repetition then continues with, she wished she had long hair and could make Christmas trees out of feathery grass. She wished she knew more bits to Tinker Tailor. Now Winnie is not just wishing for her family's normalcy, but she is coming to terms with the core of her pain. She wished Eva were here. Frame does this to provoke an emotional response from the reader, as we can hear the voice of the young child wishing desperately for her sister to be alive again. The mother of Nini in The Secret is introduced as quite a weak character. This adds to the young protagonist's struggle in coping with her sister's imminent death. In situations like these, you would hope that the mother would act strong for the child. Instead, she was sad and helpless, like the princess in a fairy tale when she has to empty the sea with a thimble, or spin a room full of thread in a night, or find the lost ring lying in the bottom of a lake. The simile in describing the mother as a fairy tale princess shows that how Nini's mother did not quite know what to do. She did not know how to tell her daughter that her sister was dying. So she used the euphemism of, Myrtle is sick, Nini. Her heart. The doctor said she may go at any time. Her mother was trying to play down the horror of Myrtle's condition and make it seem less frightening, but she underestimated her daughter. When Nini asks, go, Mum? And her mother replies with, pass away, Nini, be taken by God. Nini understands completely. In her mind, she knows that that meant die in death. She did not need the consoling words of her mother. Frame is showing us how a child often has a higher capability of understanding than people think. This similar technique is also used in Keel and Cool, with the protagonist Winnie making the observation that Mother always said went or passed away or passed beyond when she talked of death, as if it were not death really, only pretend. Although Winnie is only a young child, she has already grasped the reality of death, despite her mother's best efforts. As Keel and Cool is written in a third-person omniscient, we are allowed an insight into the mother's mind. While she is watching Joan and Winnie play, she sighed. The children were such happy little things. They didn't realize. The diction choices of happy and little emphasize the innocence and vulnerability of the children. It also shows how the mother sees them as too young to understand what has happened. The ellipses at the end seem as though the mother is afraid of exposing the children to something as tragic as Eva's death, but it is apparent that it is already too late. Frame is showing, through the perspective of the mother and of Winnie, that although the parent may attempt to protect their child from such harsh realities as death, It is something that cannot be hidden. Winnie understood that her sister had died, and there was nothing that could be done to change this fact. Symbolism is also used near the end of The Secret. The protagonist is sleeping when she suddenly wakes up, and the shadow of the plum tree outside was waving up and down on the bedroom wall. This personification gives a sense of foreboding. The tree seems to be beckoning to Nini, and it feels sinister and malicious. The plum tree is a representation of Myrtle's inevitable death waiting outside their window. Nini is frightened, but she tries to feel hopeful for the new day. I thought tomorrow there'll be a ripe plum on the plum tree, and Myrtle and I will eat it. And then I fell asleep. She tried to convince herself that everything would be all right in the morning. This is a very childlike trait and portrays her naivety. This plum tree, which had initially seemed so menacing to Nini, was turned into a false sense of hope. The ending of the story is rather ambiguous. We do not know if Myrtle really did die or not, but it is implied that Myrtle would have died. There is also a use of symbolism in Keel and Cool, as indicated by the title. When Winnie and Joan were playing, Winnie suddenly looked up in the sky and watched a seagull flying over. I'm Keel, it seemed to say. Come home, Cool, Keel, Keel. The onomatopoeia captures the longing in the seagull's voice. This is a parallel to Winnie's pain and her need for her sister. She asks, why was the seagull crying out, I'm Keel, as if it were calling for somebody who wouldn't come? Keel, come home, Cool, it cried. The personification of the flying bird humanizes it and makes it even more similar to Winnie. The question that she poses is not just about the bird, it is also about herself. Winnie is wondering why it is that she is still wanting her sister to come back when she knows that she will not. Frame made the seagull a symbol for Winnie's character, calling after a sister that would never return. This idea is what ends the story with the finality of, up in the sky there was a seagull as white as chalk, circling and crying, Keel, come home, Cool, and Cool would never come, ever. Janet Frame dealt with death in both The Secret and Keel and Cool. She explored the ways in which a child reacts to this concept. She also illustrated how the parents attempted to make the situation less terrifying to protect their innocent child. Unfortunately, this was futile, as the children already knew. The underlying current of the stories was the despair that the children experienced. Both Winnie and Nini loved their sisters dearly, and neither knew quite what to do without them. This suffering that the protagonists underwent could be seen as a reflection of how Frame herself felt when losing her sisters. These two stories were successful in truly capturing the emotions of these characters in their realization of the finality of death.